Welcome, ladies and gentlemen and Bromeliad enthusiasts. Thank you for joining the October La Bellona Valley Bromeliad Society Zoom presentation featuring Graeme Barclay from New Zealand with his topic, Growing Bromes in the Bush in New Zealand. I'm Ken Simpson, the Vice President of the LBVBS, and we welcome our members and guests. Thank you for joining us. The Zoom presentation protocol, Paul has muted all of the participants for this presentation. Please stay muted during the presentation. Adjust the view on your screen in your Zoom window for either speaker or gallery. And Graeme will take questions after his presentation. You may unmute yourself for your question only. When finished, please mute yourself again. By the way, all of the pictures the introduction are plants that belong to Graeme, and here we go. Graeme is the current BSI director for New Zealand, assistant editor of the BSI Journal, and manager of the Bromeliad Species Database, the BSD, a brand new resource he has designed and helped construct that is due to be hosted on the BSI website in 2022. He's a three-term and current president of the Bromeliad Society of New Zealand and convener of the Kiwi Broms, the 21st Australian Bromeliad Conference, due to be held in Auckland in March of 2023. Graeme has grown bromeliads for over 20 years, purely as a hobbyist, the last half focusing on building and maintaining a large species collection at his native bush-clad property in Auckland. His passion is growing species as they would in habitat, trialing and experimenting with different growing methods to achieve optimum cultivation results. To facilitate this, he has imported a number of bromeliad shipments from Australia, Hawaii, and Florida in recent years to help increase the range of plants available to local growers. Graeme is also an active species seed grower, hybridizer of Neoregelia, and is a regular contributor of species and cultivation articles for the BSNZ Monthly Bromeliad Journal. The LBVBS is a nonprofit organization. Attendance at our Zoom meet presentations is free to all bromeliad enthusiasts. If you would like to receive announcements of our future meetings, please email your name to lbvbs@dslextreme.com. And if you want to help support our efforts, you can make a donation to the club and offset our presentation costs. Use your phone camera and take a picture of the PayPal link or the QR code below and make a donation. Jean has posted on chat links to sites, and if people can contribute their thoughts on the chat. So I'm going to turn this over to Graeme.
Thank you, Ken. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, I need to, there we go.
Okay, so tell me when I can share my screen.
You're welcome to do that now.
Okay. Okay, can we all see that?
Beautiful.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Ken and Paul and Barry, for the introduction. It's great to be here, and I hope there's a few people watching today that haven't seen parts of this talk before. It's kind of a conglomeration of 2 or 3 different talks I've done over the years. So I've pulled out the best bits and put it together, and hopefully it'll be great for your members to learn a little bit about New Zealand and see how we grow things down here. So basically, the talk is in three parts. The first part is just gives you a brief insight to how we do things in New Zealand in terms of the Bromeliad Society and what we grow well and what we grow not so well. The second part, we'll look at a bit more detail on some of the species that I personally grow in my garden and things that grow well for us down here, and finish off with a few tips that I can pass on about growing bromeliads and trees. As you can see in that photograph there, and as you'll see in the photos following, I grow a lot of the plants as they would in nature, mounted on various kinds of trees. So I've got a few little tips and tricks to show you to help you explore doing that. So firstly, I thought I would just show you a map of the world, because not everybody knows where little old New Zealand is. As you can see, we're in the bottom of the South Pacific there, little brother to Australia, and the blue line across the bottom there kind of represents the latitude that Auckland is, which is kind of the center of the main growing region of New Zealand. And as you can see, we're about probably 1,500 kilometers south of the Rio de Janeiro in South America, where a lot of the species come from. And we're probably on a similar latitude to, say, Monterey in California, that you'll be familiar with. So we're a little bit further north than you guys are, and we're a little bit further south than they are in South America. However, a lot of the plants have adapted quite well to growing in New Zealand, as you will see. And you know, things aren't too bad for us here. We struggle with some of the tropical plants, obviously, but yeah, more about that later on. So that's where we are. The little gold star there is obviously the Gold Coast of Australia, and yeah, has some similarities to growing in New Zealand, but some of the warmer species, as I say, we certainly struggle with them in New Zealand. Okay, so firstly, before we look at some pictures, here is the map of New Zealand, and I know some of you would be interested in our growing conditions. So there they all are. Average temperature in summer and winter. You can see that we're quite temperate. We don't have extremes of cold or heat. So as I said, a lot of the plants are able to adapt to that temperature range quite well. The further south you go into the South Island of New Zealand, that's where you're getting into the much colder winter temperatures down to zero, a lot of frosts, a lot of snow. But in the North Island, where all the red dots are, you can see that they're all around the edge of the island. There's no snow or and very few frosts in those areas. So hence the bromeliads are able to be grown quite well there. The red dots are where you will commonly find collections and growers. The green dots are the bromeliad groups, sub-societies of New Zealand. New Zealand society's been going for almost 60 years now. And we're one of the oldest societies in the world, and also one of the largest societies in the world, with almost 300 members worldwide. So a lot of history with New Zealand bromeliads, which we don't have really time to go into today. But yeah, the yellow dot, of course, is Auckland, which is where I live. So that just gives you an idea of where we grow things. The blue dots on the South Island are locations where there are some bromeliads grown in botanical gardens, such as Puya, Dickia, a lot of the hardier, higher altitude species you will find in some botanical gardens down there, but you won't find many bromeliads in the South Island in people's gardens, because they obviously do not handle the cold that well. Rainfall in Auckland, as you can see, fairly not too extreme, but we do get it is reasonably wet all year round, on and off. And we also get a lot of wind in Auckland as well. So firstly, just some of the things that we do well here and do grow well. If you come to New Zealand, and I'm assuming some of you have been here and you've visited gardens, you will see lots of Regias, foliage Regias, and you'll see lots of Nerigelias. Quite common in other places around the world, I guess, but many of these plants have been here for many, many years, and there's also been a number of hybridists in operation here, as you saw a couple of months ago with Andrew Devonshire's talk. But Regia hybridizing has been a forte of New Zealand, and we'll see some examples a little bit later on. So these are the gardens you will see when you visit us. These gardens are growing in pretty much full sun in a lot of cases. As I said, we don't get long periods of hot, dry weather in summertime. It's normally interspersed with cloudy periods and rain and a bit of wind to cool things down. So as you can see in this members, this is actually not my garden. This is another member's garden. You can see lots of full sun Nerigelias, fireballs, Nerigelia rosy morn down here. You have Ecmia orlandiana on a huge big driftwood hunk here with some Talentia usneoides, and lots of hardy Nerigelias you'll find in the gardens because they can grow in full sun pretty much all year round. Here's another example. This is a garden in Tauranga, which is about 2.5 to 3 hours south of Auckland in the sunny Bay of Plenty. So here you can see this member has planted Nerigelias in stones all the way around his pool, and these are getting full sun pretty much all day, and they generally will survive okay without too much burning and bleaching. We do get a little bit of that sometimes, but generally it's not a major problem like I know some of you guys experience. So as I said, Regia hybrids are probably what New Zealand is most famous for in recent years. About 30 years ago, Andrew Malloy, who had a business called Kiwi Bromeliads, began hybridizing some of the more common and hardy Brazilian species together. Regia Fosteriana, Regia Gigantea, Regia hieroglyphica, Platinema variegata, Fenestralis, and Filippo Coburgii were probably the 6 most common ones that he used. And he made many different new hybrids, as we've seen the likes of David Shigi and David Fell in Hawaii also doing. And what he did was he combined a lot of those throughout several generations to create these 3 plants. Here are just 3 examples. So we've been very spoiled over many years to have virtually every color, shape and size Regia you can think of. It really doesn't matter what color you want or what size you want. There's pretty much a plant here that will suit your garden. So it's fantastic because they're all very hardy. They don't mark in winter time, and you'll find them in pretty much every garden and collection you go to in New Zealand. There are also some issues, as I alluded to earlier. Cold is one of our problems we have here, and these next slides are kind of related to cold, but this is an interesting photo. This photo was from my previous house about 12, 13 years ago, and you can see Alcantaria and pots in my courtyard here. And this particular property was much lower than the property I'm in now, pretty much at sea level. And in the depths of winter, you can get a fairly bad frost. And as many of you may know, Alcantarias and frosts don't mix. They don't like it, and their leaves will very quickly turn to brown paper the next day. So the interesting thing about this photo is that you can see in the top right-hand corner there, the very center of the plant is actually still alive. You can see the green growing down in the middle there. And so what I did was I cut all the leaves off after a month or two. I repotted the plants, I refed them, and the photo on the bottom there is the plant in my new house exactly 2 years later. So you can see that they don't actually die. They're very, very tough. And as long as you look after them, they will actually grow out and you won't even know the difference. So that's just something to remember if you do get frost damage on Alcantarias or Regias. We also get this happening a lot, particularly lower leaf damage in winter. Certain plants like this Alcantaria Bobby Gold here have quite weak, and they will go brown down the center of the leaves if you don't look after them, keep them warm. And we get a lot of cold spotting on a lot of particularly Echnea, Cordia, those kind of species, where the cold just attacks them, and they can't handle being cold and wet at the same time outside. Not so bad inside a greenhouse, but definitely outside, that's where we have our issues. So a lot of the plants that look fantastic overseas that we drool over, we really struggle to grow them in our gardens here, which is a bit of a shame. But we can grow other things, which is nice. So yeah, things like this. This is a Guzmania bismarcki that I had in the greenhouse initially. Decided it got too big and it had to live outside, so I put it in a dryish place out there. But sure enough, after a year, the whole thing just rotted and died away because it just doesn't like the cold and being cold and wet during winter time. In terms of pests, we don't have too many issues in New Zealand. We don't have snakes here, which is great. But we do have these little critters, which is the New Zealand native weta. They're kind of like a prehistoric grasshopper. And they can grow quite large, and they love sitting in your greenhouse or around your plants, and they love looking at what are your favorite plants, and then they go and eat them during the middle of the night. So they always eat the best leaves, and they always eat the leaves near the top of the plant. So they have certainly ruined many a great show plant for me over the years, especially in a bush area like I live, as you'll see shortly, where they basically live. It's their natural habitat. So here we are. So this is a satellite map of Auckland, where the yellow dot was before on the map. The GB there is obviously me, and I'm very, very close to the Manukau Harbour here. I'm probably only about 400 meters from the harbour as the laterally, but I'm 120 meters above sea level. So you can see it goes from sea level in these centre areas of the city to quite steep. And this dark green area on the left-hand side here is the Waitakere National Park, which is a large native bush area with a maximum height of 470 meters. The blue dot is where we have our monthly New Zealand Society meetings. The red dot is the Auckland City Centre. The green dot is where we're going to be having our Kiwi Broms conference in a couple of years' time, or more about that later. And the yellow dot is where the America's Cup yacht racing was held at the start of the year out on the Hauraki Gulf out here. So that just gives you an idea of where we are, and the next photo will give you an idea of what the terrain looks like. So this is looking towards the foothills of the national park, and you can see the city fringes have kind of over probably the last 70 to 80 years have slowly made their way into the native bush area. So there's still a lot of large native trees and a lot of large sections, which I was lucky enough to buy one almost 10 years ago now. So this is what it looked like when we first purchased the property. About half an acre, 2,000 square meters. So we're essentially in the city suburbs, but this property is totally surrounded by native bush, and it's kind of like having a native bush oasis in the city, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. About 25% of the area is native bush, little tracks and little waterways down the bottom there, and lots of trees to play with. So I very quickly coined the idea of turning this into a natural habitat garden, where I could display species, as I said earlier, how they would normally grow in the wild, particularly in Brazil, because a lot of the Brazilian species grow so well here. So this gives you an idea looking back up towards the house and across the lawn. There's a large lawn area. And when we got here, lots of the gardens were just white shell or pebbles, and there were basically nothing in them. So it was just a matter of moving plants from my other house, truckloads and truckloads of plants, and then slowly populating the gardens and adding plants to the trees. So this has been kind of a work in progress over the last 10 years. And there were two large oak trees on the property, pin oak trees, that were basically the only non-natives. So I decided they had to go because, of course, they dropped their leaves every winter and covered all of the bromeliads and leaves, which I don't like. Whereas the natives are evergreen and they don't drop their leaves at all. So what I did was I chopped all those down, and then below the stumps, I left the stumps maybe 4 meters tall, so I could plant bromeliads on them. And at the bottom of the trees, I created big heaps of all the logs of the trunks, and then I just simply put some of the bromeliads onto the logs and naturalized on there. So you can see a number of Nerogelia species there, or just Scideliano fasciatas. They are just sitting amongst the logs, and they've been there for 10 years and are perfectly happy. No soil at all. So here's just some other quick photos. Some of the large trees in the section are these giant Canuka trees. They're kind of like a tea tree, and they have paper bark on them, which is obviously not ideal for attaching bromeliads, but I've worked out that you can do that certainly with the stoloniferous species. You can staple them on with fence staples, and they'll hold on there perfectly okay and grow well. Some of the plants, like the Alcantarias here, were put directly into the ground, and some of them are also still in pots, just to allow me to move them around a lot. But really depends on the positioning and the type of plant. Some more examples here. Talentias, there's only certain Talentias we grow well outside of New Zealand. Most of the more delicate grey-leafed varieties, we generally grow them under cover in greenhouses or conservatories. But other things like Talentia somnians here is like a weed in New Zealand. I know it's very rare in some places, but it just grows everywhere here and goes this lovely orangey pinky color. When you grow it in full sun, you can see Talentia kirchhoffiana up the top here. This is the Rodrigueziana and a secunda, and various hardy things like Bergeron and Aranthos and tenuifolia grow very well outside. But apart from the green-leaf varieties, not a lot else really thrives outdoors that well. Just another view there looking across the garden. This is a few years ago, these photos, so there's actually a few more plants on the trees than you see there now. But yeah, Alcantarias are very popular in New Zealand, and they bloom regularly for us in the summer months. We have many different varieties, and I probably have maybe 20 different species that I've collected over the years and grown from seed. One other thing I get in this property is, as you can see here, certain times of the year, being so high up and in like a mountain bush valley, we get this lovely cloud sort of moving in, which is like a foggy mist, obviously, and that helps hydrate some of the plants and the trees. This is common in autumn time and sometimes in springtime. So that's just another nice thing to have, which really allows the plants to thrive as they would being in a cloud forest environment. As I said, I also have or grow some things in a warmer environment. I had a count up a year or two ago, and probably around about 500 different species and varieties all up. Maybe a few more now actually, and that's across about 45 genera. So a lot of those, obviously, as I said, don't enjoy growing outside that well. Things like Hohenbergers and many Talentias and a lot of the Ecnias, obviously. You just cannot grow them all year round outside. They're fine in summertime, but once wintertime comes along and it starts to rain and starts to blow, and yeah, it's just very, very difficult to keep them going well. I also like to grow plants to an optimal condition so I can participate on our shows every year, which helps with obviously education and enjoyment for our members. So this is just one part of, I have 2 greenhouses, one that I keep sealed up in winter time. I open it in summertime and I seal it fully in winter, and I heat it if necessary at night, so it never gets below about 8 or 9 degrees in the middle of the night in winter. The other greenhouse has open sides on it, and while it's fully covered, it does let the wind through, so some of the more hardy species and plants grow out there. We don't have time today to look at everything in the greenhouse, so we're going to focus on some of the plants, as I said, that grow well in the trees. Some of these you will obviously recognize, and you may be growing them in pots or in the garden at the moment, but we must remember that many of the species from Brazil, in fact, most of the Regias and most of the Nerigelias as well, all actually are epiphytes. And there are obviously some that grow on the ground and don't grow in trees, but a lot of them do. And a lot of them grow, I have found, actually grow better in the trees than they will in a pot. Some of you may realize they don't put out a lot of roots, a lot of these species. So if you can attach them to a tree, they'll very quickly attach, as we'll see later on, and they will flower regularly for you. The clump of the Regia guttata on the right here is on a tree about 4 meters above the ground, and that blooms every year, 5 or 6, or as you can see, probably 8 spikes there every year. And that just shows you how quickly the pups grow and how quickly they develop, and the older plants just simply wither away down below as they would in the wild. So I have that clump flowering outside right now, and yeah, it's just regular as clockwork. So Regia Erythrodactylon and vagans are very common here, and as you can see there, look great growing in the trees. 2 other larger Regias that I also grow as epiphytes, Hieroglyphica and Altodaceri. Hieroglyphica can be a bit touchy to grow sometimes. It doesn't. You have to get the watering right with it, and it doesn't. It likes rainwater. It doesn't like hard water, and but it does like growing as an epiphyte, I've found, as long as you keep it stable, and as long as it's got enough leaf matter falling into the plant to actually feed it is a key thing. And we must remember that in the wild, these species are all getting their nutrients from falling debris, bird poop and the like. So you have to make sure that they are getting something falling into their rosettes. Otherwise, they will struggle. If they don't, you really do have to supplement them with some kind of foliar feeding. So these are lovely. This Altodaceri is one of my favorites. It has sword-shaped leaves, quite a large plant. And that clump has been up in about 3 meters up a tree and just keeps getting larger and larger and looking better and better all the time. Regia Philippocoburgi is another popular one. Some of you will obviously have that and grow that well. It's very common here. Flowers regularly once it gets to clumping size, and again I grow that epiphytically up a large tree. Also the variegated form Regia Raphael is a great plant for mounting on trees. Our native tui, you can see there on the right hand side, is one of our famous native birds, endemic birds, and they love the nectar of the Alcantarias and the Regia Philippos. And you can see a great example of how we can grow some species in full sun. They really do go a lovely golden orange, yellow color if you really cook them up here, and we don't get burning or bleaching like you would in some other places. So it's a lovely plant to grow in the garden. Another one of my favorites, Regia Gigantea variety, Scideliano. Now, many of you probably have this plant labeled as Regia Nova, which is actually a wrong name. It's kind of like a nurseryman's name, and it should be labeled this if you have it. The interesting thing about this is it's a very slow grower, and it really holds its shape and form for many years and doesn't bloom. So it's a great one to collect as a feature plant for the garden, and can grow quite large to well over 1 meter wide. I put this little photo of this worm here because this was a very interesting thing I discovered a few months ago. You can see this leaf here in the middle of the rosette. I was preparing this plant to take an updated photo of it, so I was kind of cleaning the leaves, and when I pulled the tea leaves out of there, which are fallen from the tea tree and the canuka above, I found a worm inside it. So I have no idea how a worm got from about 1 foot below up into halfway up the plant. I don't think some bird would have dropped it in there, but perhaps worms do decide to migrate up bromeliads and live within their leaves. Who knows? I've never seen that before, but that was quite an unusual thing to find. Another favorite is this beautiful species from Brazil, Regia Pesticiana, which some of you may not have seen before. This is probably one of the largest Regia species around. It can grow up to 2 meters wide and 1.5 meters tall. So it's bigger than most alcantarias. Beautiful glyph leaves, and it's actually, I believe, is actually now extinct or very near extinct in the wild in Brazil, which is a real shame. So we're very lucky to have this plant in New Zealand. It's also in Australia, and I think is in the United States, but maybe quite rare up there. But there's another beautiful plant if you have a shady spot. It doesn't like full sun so much. Again, a slow grower and a beautiful large plant for the garden. Dries Fosteriana, another one of my favorites. I have a garden called Mulford's Garden. Obviously, Fosteriana is named after Mulford Foster. And I probably have 10 or 12 different forms of this species. The ones you can see here in the center here are a seed-grown variety called Golden Legend, which came from seed from Australia into New Zealand many years ago, and is a beautiful golden-leaved, wide-leafed variety. The plant here on the right-hand side was actually one of the first bromeliads I ever bought about well over 20 years ago now, and that is actually the same plant I bought 25 years ago. And the reason I put that photo here is to show you that what I've found is that if you starve some of these plants, in other words, grow them non-potted with no food, they will grow so slowly and they won't bloom, and they won't do anything for years and years and years. So that plant, I've had at 4 different houses, and it's finally in my garden after 20 years. And just because I repotted it a year ago and moved it into a new position, it finally bloomed. So that just shows you that if you want to put a plant on ice, you can actually do that. And many species will actually do that if you don't feed them and basically don't look after them. They will hold their shape and size, and a lot of them will just sit there and do nothing. So quite amazing, really. A couple of other great plants we grow well in New Zealand. Breezy Lata is a species from the northern parts of South America, and is probably going to become a Ceparopsis one day because of the different flower structure and flowers to most Regias. But it's another great plant. The bloom lasts for six months to a year in full color, and I grow this actually up a tree as well, and the pups grow fast and you get a bloom pretty much every year. So there's basically color on this plant all year round because of the long lasting bloom. Whitrockia lepidinum is a cultivar of Whitrockia gigantea, and is very, very common here. Again, you can see the lovely purple mottling we get on this when we grow it in a lot of sun here. You'd struggle to do that overseas in some hotter places. It would probably burn, and it's more of a shade growing plant. We do grow them in the shade here, and they do clump up into very large plants. They generally only bloom once they clump, but I do grow some of them in full sun as well as in the shade. You can see it pretty looks like a lot of Nerigelias the way it's growing there. Whitrockia superba, this is a very large giant form that originally came from Franz Gruber in Colombia. And this plant can grow massive. It's actually in the shade here, but I'm going to be growing it in full sun. And it can get to well over 1 meter tall and wide, which is much bigger than the usual species, the usual form that many of us cultivate. And as I said earlier, most of my Nerigelia collection, species collection, I've moved out of the greenhouses over the years, and I've attached them to the trees. So there's about 125 to 130 neo species, and I've managed to collect around about 80 to 85 of those over the years. We've been lucky to collect or import a lot of them from Brazil in the older years, from Elton Lemmy's collection, and we have a really good range of species and plants here to play with. So you can see here the Rubro Batata is the one with the light shining through it, and has beautiful patterned leaves. It looks fantastic with the morning sun shining through it, and grows really well, as do other ones like this. Rubrifolia is the darker one up to the left hand side, bit of a larger stoloniferous neo, and this little dark Ampullaceae here actually came from Elton Lemmy. It's a very small, compact, dark form of Ampullaceae, which is a lovely clumping type. Nigellariums. I'm not sure how popular they would be in your areas up there, where it's a lot hotter and drier than it is in New Zealand, but they are extremely popular here. And like the Neos, we've managed to import many most of the species. Actually, there's about 35 Nigellarium species, and I have around about 25 of them at the moment, plus quite a few different forms, variegated forms and what have you. So what I like to do is and down in the species garden, I like to grow them all in clumps or all in beds together. So I know where they are, and it's just easy to have a growing condition and shaded area where they can all thrive. So yeah, they're all clumped in here together, and it's yeah, easy to take off pups and move them around and experiment with what each species likes best. So yeah, if you have a shady spot for the garden, these are definitely something to look at, because one of the advantages is that again, the blooms are very, very long lasting, and some of them will stay in colour for well over 6 months, 9 months, and particularly in winter time, that's excellent for the garden because it provides colour when everything else is not flowering. Similarly with the Edmondoas, Edmondoa lindeni, we have several forms of that here. Another great shade plant, very popular, and they just look fantastic growing in the group, especially the variety Roseas, the pinker coloured varieties as well, look great. Guzmanias, you won't see too many Guzmanias in our gardens here, again, because a lot of them come from the warmer climes of northern South America. So a lot of them have been in New Zealand in the past, but they've kind of been lost or forgotten about, probably died due to the cold during winter, a lot of them. But there are certain species like these two that thrive here. They grow extremely well. They're large plants. Again, the Guzmania variegata on the right-hand side here, you can see in full bloom. You can see the plant behind it here still has color on it, and that bloomed 18 months before this one. So they are quite incredible how long they can hold their color. And I've had specimens of Guzmania variegata still putting out their tiny white flowers 12 months after the first flowers started blooming. So they bloom for a long, long time, and they take a long time to wither away. So again, two great species to collect if you've got shadier spots. Now, they will grow in full sun areas, these two, but I've found they're better color in the shade for us. Another great one that I imported a few years ago, Guzmania carinii. This used to be called, or used to be known as, Squarosa Pink in some circles, but it's now been properly described, and as you can see there, has lovely shocking pink bracts. It's a little bit smaller than the usual Squarosa, but I've found this has been another great plant to add to our gardens here. It grows fast. It has many pups. The pups, if you feed them and look after them well, will grow from taking it off the mother to blooming in pretty much a year. So another great plant. I also like to collect and put down in the garden quite a few oddities, such as this one. This is an interesting Quesnelia that many of you may not have seen before. A pendulous plant that comes from Brazil, obviously. We believe this particular form came from the type specimen from the Vienna Botanical Gardens, which was taken there back in the late 1870s, I believe. And it's quite strange that this is not more commonly grown, because as you can see there, it's a fantastic, has fantastic long flower spikes, beautiful blue, azure blue flowers. And it seems to be quite rare in collections, especially in the up in the United States. So it would be one to look out for if you can find it. It likes the shade. You can see I've been a bit lazy there. I've just taken my pot from hanging somewhere else and put it in that tree. So this clump is now being all cut up, and I'll be actually attaching them in several different clumps to those trees there. An interesting thing about it is you can see how they lean out from the clump, and I think that's possibly to do with its habit in the wild, where it's attached to a tree and the plants lean out from the main clump in order to allow the pendulous flower spikes to hang down, so the birds can obviously have access to the flowers. That's my theory anyway, but yeah, another great plant. Bilbergias. Bilbergias are quite common here, but probably more so the hybrids, like they are everywhere. But I don't really grow too many Bilbergia hybrids. I've kind of focused more on Nerogelia hybridizing. But Bilbergia species I collect, and these two are two of my favorites. And again, they are very, very hardy, large plants, grow very well, just attached to trees, or as you can see, Scideliano here is just sitting on a log. You can see in the background here, this is Canistrum alagoanum from Alagoas state in eastern Brazil. Now that's more of a warmer loving species, and you can just see on the leaves there how I'm getting cold damage on that plant. So I really have to kind of look after that one outside. It doesn't really like being outside in winter time, but I have managed to bloom it okay outside. This is one of the giant Ecnias that I have. There's a little bit of a question mark about what this plant actually is, whether it's actually Ecnia floribunda from around Rio de Janeiro, or whether it's actually a Hohenbergia. When it flowers, and I haven't bloomed it yet, but the mother plant that this came off has bloomed in Australia, and the flowers are quite strange on it. They kind of resemble a Hohenbergia, but in some ways they resemble Ecnia floribunda. So we're kind of it's a bit of a mystery what this plant actually is, and maybe it's just a special form of it. But it's an absolute giant. That plant is now 2 meters wide, and from the ground up would be 1.5 meters tall, and it's no sign of blooming yet. Ichmea nudicalis, probably a favorite for many of you, and also one of mine. We kind of call it the Christmas bromeliad in New Zealand because it generally blooms starting around about this time of the year, right through till Christmas time and into the new year. We get many multiple bloomings of many different forms, and a lot of them can all bloom at the same time, so it creates a fantastic sight. So as you can see there, like the nigellariums, what I like to do is I group them all together. So I have probably around about 35 different forms of this species that I've collected, and they all grow on these stumps or on this log. Now, some of them are in pots down below there, yeah, just enjoy having them all together so I can compare how they grow and enjoy the blooms. Ichmea gigantea, this is another interesting one that some of you may not have seen too much of. You may have realized that I haven't showed you Ichmea blanchettiana, which most of you will probably grow in your sunny gardens over there. Ichmea blanchettiana doesn't really like New Zealand too much. We do grow it here. It can be grown. But again, if it gets too wet and cold and windy in wintertime, it can sulk a bit and look a bit ratty. So this plant is a similar color and a similar size and is a little bit hardier. So we like to grow that in some of our garden landscapes. It doesn't have a big branched flower like blanchettiana does. It actually has a little wee flower down in the center that resembles an Ichmea fasciata flower, which is a bit strange, but it's a gorgeous form and gorgeous color. So if you can find one of these, they're definitely worth getting hold of and growing in a sunny spot. Ichmea spectabilis. Here's an interesting little story. Down in my lower bush garden, I decided to put the pup on the left-hand side there onto the top of a tree fern stump one day. And the local blackbirds decided they reckoned it was an awesome place to build a nest. So pretty soon a nest turned up and eggs turned up, and it was all looking pretty good. But unfortunately a storm came along, and I think it pretty much blew the nest out of there, and one day I went down and had a look and it was gone. So unfortunately the birds didn't survive that, but you can see the same plant on the right hand side there, about 18 months later has just it's probably quite happy that the nest has disappeared and I can get on with growing. So just interesting how they adapt and how good they can look after a little while of adapting to a new place. Another adaptation example is this species. Ichmea purpurea rosea is a lovely plant that is a little bit uncommon in some places, but again, we struggle to grow it in a pot or in the garden generally in wintertime here. It doesn't really like getting wet feet, and you can rot them very easily. So what I decided to do was to take it out of the pot and staple it onto a tree there. And you can see how the original mother on the right hand side there has eventually put out a pup. That pup's flowered, and then the pup that's coming off that plant is looking nice and healthy, and the plant is very happily growing there now and blooming away and growing as it would in the wild in Brazil. So I've kind of taken it from a position that it didn't like and put it back to a position that it's used to growing in the wild. And what we find is that even though it's growing in the same location, it's not getting cold, wet feet in wintertime. The air is circulating around it. It's naturally, obviously, not getting wet, and it's free draining from its roots. And we're not having those issues with cold damage as much. So that's just something to bear in mind too. If you're having problems with cold damage, try it growing. If it's an epiphyte, try growing it on a tree in a sunny spot and see how you go with it. Another interesting one, Whitmackia tentaculifera, which used to be Eckmea tentaculifera. Another species that's quite rare, but can go a lovely golden, even a pale cream color if you grow that in full sun with lovely black tips. So this is naturalized quite well for me outside on growing on some logs, and it's good to see, because previously I had grown it only in the greenhouse. So I was too scared to try it outside. But once you get spare plants and new pups, you try things in different spots and see how they go. That's what it's all about. Similarly, Eckmea disjuncta was another one that was pretty much a greenhouse only plant. And I decided, no, this thing comes from southeastern Brazil. It should grow outside okay on a tree. And sure enough, put it on a tree, it puts out roots, it puts out pups, and we're getting blooms. So again, it can be done if you try it. As I said earlier, Alcantaria is very popular here, and you'll see many forms of Geniculata, Glaziana, many forms of Alcantaria imperialis. We've had seed grown here for probably 50 years of that species, and we have many different forms of it. Large ones, small ones, wide leaf, thin leaf, red, green, bluey color. They're fantastic to have in the gardens, and do really well for us. There's just another shot there. You can see down here we've got several forms of imperialis here and here. This is Alcantaria heloisae here, Alcantaria patriae, extensa, Edmundui, and a few others down here. So I try to grow them all together and see what they like. But generally they're all fairly hardy. Some of the forms of extensa don't really enjoy the cold so much, but because they come from higher latitudes in Brazil up towards Bahia and places like that. So it can be a bit tough for some of them, but in the main, most of them grow very well. Hohenbergers, as I said earlier, most of them are grown inside in the greenhouse, but there are a few that are quite hardy. But these two are quite rare here still, again, because I think some people just try and grow them in any place outside without too much thought, and eventually they lose them. So over the years, we've probably lost a lot of species we should have here. Case in point, the Hohenberger stellata there. You could not find that a few years ago in New Zealand, so I re-imported it, and this is a beautiful red clone of it. And again, I'm kind of struggling to get pups going on it outside, but what I'm trying to do is get these species back into New Zealand so others can enjoy them, and we can grow them in our gardens again. And just to kind of finish off on the things that grow well here, these two are probably a couple of plants that you don't see a lot of in your neck of the woods, because they come from the Andes regions of Chile and of South America around the coastlines. So Vesicularia bicolor and Gardia literalis. These plants grow like weeds here. They grow into clumps very quickly. Once they clump up, they will bloom regularly, and there are some gardens have huge swathes of them, and the Gardias can look fantastic when they're all in bloom at certain times of the year. So if you come to New Zealand, you will see some of these, particularly in some of the botanical gardens and a lot of the larger gardens around. Finally, Talantias. As I said earlier, we have to be picky and choosy about what Talantias we grow where. Some plants like Guatemalensis, you see there, Leiboldiana, Bergeron, and some of the more higher altitude plants like Yunkari and Izii and Gepiana. Plants like that are quite tough, that grow from higher altitudes, do grow okay for us. But it's the more delicate grey leaf things that we have to be more careful with. The Bergeron here is called Bergeron Major. It's quite a large coalescent form. It's a little bit shy flowering, but again, it grows like a weed here and forms huge clumps and has quite large extended pink and white flowers. You can see here the Talentia AZE in the tree there. I've managed to bloom a couple of those in the last few years. We had some grown from seed here probably about 15 years ago. So what we found was that mollycoddling them and keeping them indoors and keeping them warm in winter was actually the wrong thing to do. What they actually like is to be put down in the bush with no treatment at all, to allow all of the tea leaves and the leaves to fall into them. And I grew the plant you see blooming there. I grew from a plant that was about one to 1.5 feet wide to a full-size 3.5 foot blooming plant in 2 years' time. So they actually are not as slow as you think if you give them the right conditions. They just need cool winters, cool nights, and a little bit of food that they can feed off through their leaves, and you'll get them growing well. You can see on the right hand side there, my friend John Mitchell and I had a competition who could grow the longest spike, and unfortunately I lost. So yeah, finally, part 3. As I said, I'm just going to give you a few tips. You may have seen a lot of these plants and wondered, how do I actually do it as far as attaching them to the trees? So I've just put together a few slides just to show you some of the tips and tricks that I use. And here you can see some Scotax tiger that are mounted, and some other Carcharodon varieties mounted on some yuccas in the top of the garden. I decided the yuccas were blocking a bit of light out to the house, and so they all had to go. And I decided I'd just put these plants up on there, and you can see how they catch the sun and look great. So if you have a place to put these out of their pots, I would highly recommend it. So what I use are basically these few tools here, just some nails, 2 sizes of staples, a large one. This large one here would be probably 1.5 inches long, and a smaller one that's just under 1 inch long. The zip tie there is around about probably 1.5 foot long, and allows me to put it around, thin trunked trees, which is quite handy. And this big large nail here, that allows you to nail it directly into a tree trunk, and you can actually hang a pot off that quite easily. So that's just a good mechanism of creating a pot mount very quickly and easily. So here's an example. We saw that Regia Pesticiana earlier on, and this is how I initially mounted it on the tree about 10 years ago. And you can see there, what I did was I just nailed it to this tree trunk, and then I wrapped the actual root ball of the plant. Didn't have any soil on it, it was only the roots. And what that does is it allows the new green roots to come out through the old roots and attach themselves to the actual tree trunk. So the stretch ribbing is just kind of like sweatshirt material that you can cut into strips, and you can stretch it lengthwise, and that allows you to tie it on there very tightly and keep it firm while those roots underneath are actually attaching. Another method is, here's a Guzmania squarosa that's mounted onto a palm, a Nikau palm, native Nikau. And what I've done is I've nailed directly through the root ball the hard base of the plant. You can't actually see it, the nail's far gone now, but you can see how the brown roots have come out of the base and attached themselves to the tree over a couple of years. And what I've done there also is used a piece of plastic coated wire, and that just tightly holds the plant against the tree, so in any high winds it's actually not going to move. So you have to make sure that the plant, after you mount it, isn't going to move in any kind of wind, otherwise it will struggle to put its roots out onto the tree. Similarly here, plants that have stolons or long woody stolons, you can easily staple them directly on, play around and find out what angle they sit best with. Sometimes you can find a little knoll, like a little knob like this on the right hand side to position it, to hold it upright. But that's just held on with one staple, and after a few months it'll put roots from this base area here directly onto the tree. It won't put roots out from the stolen end, so don't worry about that. What you want to do is clean up this heel end of the plant here, take away some of the paper bracts from the heel, and that allows the roots to come directly out onto the tree, as you can kind of see here. So this is an Ichneia disjuncta. It's just been stapled on into this nook between two trees, and you can see how the roots have come directly down. Now that's fully attached to the trees. I could cut that staple off now, or cut this stolen off through here, missing our friend the bee there, and or the wasp rather. He's not my friend actually, he's a wasp. And that plant would be permanently attached. As we saw earlier, so on the paper bark trees, you can't really use any kind of root attachment method. You have to use staples on stolons is really the only way you can do it. But certain plants like Neoporciflora, you can see here, and Neocompacta, things like Fireball are excellent plants to use because they have long woody stolons. Occasionally they'll break and you can just restaple them back on again, and after a while they look very naturalized and grow really well. This is a good example here of how the cable tie method works. So Talentia Junkeri is a great plant for us. Grows really well outdoors here. We get lovely color on it. The plant I have on the left there was almost a meter tall in full bloom. If you feed them well, they can grow quite large. But when this one had pups, I decided again, look, I'm going to have to try some of these on trees, which is how they grow in their natural habitat in Ecuador. So the pups were taken off and simply cleaned up and cable tied directly onto the trees. You have to be careful you don't do it too tightly, but the advantage of the zip tie is it allows you to really tension them exactly how you want them so the plant doesn't move. And you can see there how after only 6 to 8 weeks, it's starting to put roots out. Some of them are directly attached to the tree, and some of them are kind of going in the wrong direction. But after a while, they start turning if they come out the wrong side, and they'll start heading back towards the tree. Now, I had a look at these the other day, and I actually snipped the cable tie off one of them to see if it would hold on its own. But unfortunately, the plant has got a little bit too large and it's full of water, and it's still a little bit top heavy. But so I had to put another tie back on there just to hold it for a little bit longer, just till a few more roots managed to attach from the top area, which will be up around about here. So maybe in another 6 months to a year, it'll be fully attached, and then I can cut the tie off. And the advantage there too with the cable ties is that once you cut that tie off, you never ever know that it's been there, and it just looks like the plant has been growing there for years. Here's a sort of a combination method. I've used a nail to nail the pup straight through the bottom of the root cut into the tree, and then I've cable tied it again to create that second leverage point, holding it against the tree limb, and then I've anchored the cable tie around the back with another nail, and that stops that cable tie sliding up and becoming loose. So the plant can sit there in really high winds and it will never ever move. And this is what happens to that plant after only a few months. You can see here how the roots have just come straight out from all around the bottom and glued themselves to the trees. And the photo on the right hand side there is interesting. You can see how I've cut the cable tie off, and up here you can see how the roots are actually like liquid, how they have actually created a mold inside the teeth of the cable tie. That shows you how malleable Bromeliad roots are. They're actually like liquid nails coming out of the plant. And once they find their attachment, they'll form to whatever shape they adhere to. So it was really interesting to see that. And here's another good example here. So this is the real success of growing the plants on the trees. This is a Talentia dipiana pup that I cable tied to a tree. You can see here on the right-hand photo where the cable tie was just below the root ball there, or just above where the roots were coming out. Not too tight, but you can see how the plants of the roots, sorry, have just come straight out and in all directions and totally glued themselves to the tree. That's only after about 10 weeks. So less than 3 months that cable tie was cut off and we have a natural looking plant. Basically, in terms of the trees, the smoother the bark on the tree, the better. You can see these are actually what we call cabbage trees here, or cordyline. Cordyline australis is the botanical name. And they actually have quite a rough, papery bark, but it doesn't flake off. So they will attach quite well to those. But if you have trees with very, very smooth bark, they are actually the best to attach plants to. So have a look around and see what you've got. And just to finish off on the topic of roots, just to give you another idea of how interesting bromeliad roots are. This is a Quesnelia Argensis, which is another popular species that we grow here. I had this clump mounted high up in a tree for many years, but occasionally they get a bit too top heavy and plants sort of come out on the wrong angle, and it creates extra weight on the clump, and occasionally they blow down. And one day, a few months ago, this clump blew out of the tree, and I went and had a look at it. And as you can see, there's a piece of paper bark on the side of the clump here. The clump was actually nailed directly into a cut-off tree limb. So it was nailed directly into hardwood to hold it firm. But after a while, the pups that come out begin to attach themselves to anything. So they've attached themselves to the paper bark. And it's probably part of the reason why the clump has fallen off, because the paper bark obviously gives way after so much weight is put on it. And you can see here the paper bark, you can see how the roots have actually grown straight through about 5 millimeters worth of paper bark. So they haven't attached themselves to the outside of the bark. They've gone right through the other side and come out the side that is adhering to the tree. And they've probably tried to then attach themselves to the hardwood of the tree. So quite amazing how they're able to burrow through paper bark like that and get the best footing they can. So that's it. I hope you've learned something there. Quite a little, I hope it didn't go too long. I would just like to finish with a little advert if I can. As Ken mentioned earlier, we are lucky to be holding the 21st Australasian Bromeliad Conference here in March 2023. It's been postponed from earlier this year. It was scheduled for next year, and that's had to be postponed due to COVID. But next in 2022, we're hoping it's going to go ahead once the New Zealand border restrictions get relaxed, which they're looking like they will be next year. So all of the information for that conference can be found on our website, our New Zealand Society website. Registration fees, all the information about the speakers. We have some great speakers from all around the world coming, including Michael Barfuss from Austria, a Talentia expert. We have David Benzing, of course, the Bromeliad biology guru from the United States. We have David Feld from Hawaii. We have Bruce Dunstan from Australia. We have Andrew Devonshire, our local Kiwi boy, and also Dean Morman, who's another New Zealand experienced landscaper and grower. And yeah, I've probably forgotten one or two. Sorry, Jose Manzanares from Ecuador is hoping to come. And we have Martin Xiao from China, who lives in China and Singapore and grows bromeliads up there. So it's going to be a great conference. We'll be visiting some of the best gardens and collections in the Auckland area. And yeah, if you're keen to come on a trip down under and see a bit more about how we grow things, you'd be most welcome. So thanks.
Wow.
Graeme, fantastic. And yes, I learned a lot. Very nice presentation. Plus the last slide there, I like the layout of the poster there. Very nice.
Yes, that Regia there is actually a hybrid made by John Mitchell, who, as I mentioned earlier, is one of our top Regia hybridists now. It's called Regia Hunua Fireburst is its name. So we decided that was a lovely plant to use for our logo.
Graeme,
And thank you. That was a superb presentation, and your photographs and the things that you do there and sharing it with us was really a blessing. Thank you.
Graeme, it's one of the most impressive species collections anywhere in the world. And thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And let
Thanks,
me
Barry.
know, let's do some kind of a Zoom, even if it's just a short one, when you have the show in 2023. Let's set up some kind of Zoom and, introduce you guys to the world.
Yeah, I'm sure that something like that can be arranged. Yeah, I'm got a few changes going on in the garden at the moment, and I'm hoping at some stage I'll be able to do maybe a video tour as well. So that'll give people a bit more of an idea of what's there and how things are growing.
Yeah, and maybe we can have you back next year and you can show us your greenhouses.
Sure.
But I mean also to do an actual live Zoom from the conference. It could just be a short thing, a half hour, whatever. It's several years away, so we'll talk between now and then.
Yep.
So do we have any questions from the audience? You can unmute yourself and ask Graeme any questions that you might have.
I have a question while people are getting their thoughts together. Do you collect rainwater? Do you use, what's your water condition?
Yes, up until about a year and a half ago, I was using town supply tap water in the greenhouse. But we actually had a bout of water restrictions in Auckland here. Funnily enough, it didn't rain for a lot of the summer period a couple of years ago, and our city dams were very low. So I decided to put in a 2,000 litre tank, which is fed from the roof of the greenhouse. So I rigged up a pump, and I use rainwater to water all of the plants inside the greenhouse now, and a lot of them I think are enjoying that a bit better. Some of the Talentias and more tender species are certainly enjoying that. But outdoors, I didn't mention earlier, but not up where I live, being up here in kind of the cloud forest, I don't really need to water at all in the gardens. So having the plants under the trees, they all hold enough water to keep them going throughout the year, even in summertime. Maybe if it's a very, very hot, dry week in summer, I may hand water the odd thing down there, but not very often. It's not really needed. Yeah.
Good. So in terms of pests, we end up sometimes getting scale or mealy bugs. We not necessarily worms or beautiful birds other than hummingbirds, but do you have any issues like that you have to deal with?
Oh yeah, we have the usual scale and mealy bug. I think that's pretty much everywhere these days. Yeah, I didn't mention what I do find though is that growing the plants outdoors in more of a natural environment, you get far less of that because they're getting a lot more airflow around them, especially the ones growing in the trees. So you don't really find scale on them or anything like that so much. It's more the plants that are crammed in the greenhouses like we all experience. So again, in the garden, I don't have any pest control really there. I just let them go. They're there, to survive on their own devices, and that's part of the interest of doing it for me, to see how they handle it.
Well, that's exactly how my mentor, his name was R.M. Delgado, is one of the founders of the entire bromeliad world. One of the unsung founders of the BSI. But Frenchie used to go collecting in the 50s. He would drive down, literally drive down to Central and South America. Too long a story, but they bring the plants back, and they were smart enough to dip them and get rid of the initial pests. But then when he grew his plants, he said he preferred to grow them as tough as nature. And that's what he did. He almost never fertilized. Of course, he had to water in Southern California. But other than that, he just let the plants go. And they always did very well with this, what you call benign neglect.
Yep.
Do you fertilize or just rely on the tea leaves?
Yeah, it really depends on what the plant is, but generally the plants you saw in most of those photos in the garden know that they don't get any fertilizer. They're all living off the natural leaf litter pretty much. So there are some plants and pots that I have down there that, as I said, in order to keep them moving, the problem we have is in wintertime here, pretty much everything stops growing for 6 months. It gets the temperature gets down a lot, so you don't have that warmth to keep the roots going and to keep the plant moving. So a lot of plants just sit there and sulk and do nothing. So certain things I like to feed with just a bit of slow release fertilizer in the pots down there, just to keep them moving, and especially ones that I want to get pups off, or I need to get them to a good size or whatever. So however, in the greenhouse, that's a different story. Obviously, in the greenhouse that's covered, you're not getting any leaf litter in there. Very little natural food, so you have to artificially feed them if you want to have good looking plants and good blooms and regular pups and things. So yeah, it really depends on what I'm doing and where the plant is.
Have you ever tried hydrogen peroxide in your greenhouse?
No, I haven't, Pat. What do you
It's
use
very
it for?
effective on bugs in the greenhouse.
Okay.
Try
Pat,
it.
after meeting with you, I bought a gallon of 13%, and I just mixed up a little to hand spray to see how it works.
Yeah, I've been using coffee grounds in my mix. That kind of helps the scale issue quite a lot, but I don't have a big issue with scale. It happens on certain plants, but
Yeah.
I'm generally quite. I just treat it with very carefully. Treat it with a systemic insecticide is the easiest way, because if you don't and you miss a little bit on something, it can easily spread and cause big issues. So because my greenhouses are enclosed, I'm very careful with using the sprays just in the tanks of the bromeliads, and I don't have any issues with that.
What do
But
you
you do have
use?
to be careful.
What do you use as your systemic?
We used to use Confidor here, but that's actually been banned now. It's just a natural, I forget the name of it, to be honest. Yeah, but it's just a imidacloprid based systemic, which I think you'll find in most places. Yeah.
The most important thing is observation. If you know the insects are there and you can intercede, whatever the intervention is, that's the key thing. It's when you don't look at your plants, that's when things get bad.
Yeah, I think I'm like everyone. I struggle for time sometimes, working full time and 4 kids and all that kind of stuff. So
Yep.
you know, yeah, it's a bit of a battle sometimes, but
I
yeah,
hear you.
do the best you can.
Graeme, thank you very much. I'm the president of the club. I just want to really express our appreciation that you presented such a wonderful program. I have a question. How far south in New Zealand can bromeliads be grown outdoors?
Well, as I showed in my earlier map at the start, not sure if you saw that or not, but Basically, most of them, probably 95 to 99% of them are only grown outdoors and around the North Island. And probably 80% of those are in the top half of the North Island. Okay, so you're talking only, that's from Auckland area, only around about 6 to 8 hours drive south of Auckland. If you start going further south than Wellington, the bottom of the North Island into the South Island, you'll see some around Wellington. There's some Talentia growers there. The collectors further south will be growing pretty much everything they grow inside a greenhouse year round. They may have a few things like puyas and maybe an Ecmia recavata growing outside under the eaves of the house or something like that, that is impossible to kill. But as I say, the further south you go, you're running into frosts and you're running into some snow in some areas, and a lot of the plants outside of the puyas and that kind of thing don't really handle it.
Are terrestrials popular in New Zealand?
Not really for that reason. The more northern areas in our gardens up here, as I say, tend to be far more dominated with the foliage Regias, the Alcantarias, and the Neos are the three most popular genera. And you have Nigellariums, and you have obviously Talentias are popular everywhere. But yeah, it's there's a few people that grow a few Dickias and things like that, Okagavias, but they're not anywhere near as popular as the xeric genera in your part of the world, Again, because I think a lot of the reason is because we're having that cold, wet winter. A lot of the plants can handle cold, but they don't like the combination of cold and wet at the same time. That's the problem, is that it's not so much the temperature, it's actually being cold and wet for 3 months continuously. That's when you'll start having clumps falling apart and roots rotting and all that kind of stuff. So you really have to know, and that was part of the reason why I became so interested in species, because I got frustrated with killing things. And so I started to learn a lot more about them. If you know your plants, if you know where they come from, if you know the habitat where they grow, whether they're epiphytic, xeric, whatever, you'll have much more success in actually growing them well, because you can try and replicate that to your own conditions.
But the unifying factor in all of this is wind. It's air movement. It's gas exchange. And this is just the basic truth of all epiphytes, but especially bromeliads. If as soon as you get things with the air moving and they can have respiration and they can dry, they do well. And it's the dank, over wet, cold conditions that'll kill plants every time.
Yeah, for sure. There's certainly a lot that are very hardy to that. The reason the foliage Regias and many of the Neos do so well here is because they're not really that fussy when it comes to that. They can handle cold and wet, all year round if they like. They're very adaptive. They're essentially lithophytes or epiphytes in Brazil, and you can put them in a bark mix in the garden here and keep them moist all year round, and they will just grow like weeds. So it's not a hard and fast rule for everything, but again, you need to know your plants and understand what they like, what they don't.
That is the basic truth.
What about importation?
Yeah, importation is a bit of a nightmare for us. As I said, I've done several shipments now over quite a few years from collections in Australia, from Hawaii, and also a recent one just earlier this year from Florida. And it's being an island nation like Australia, it's very difficult. We have very strict border security or biosecurity. The plants have to go into quarantine for at least 3 months on arrival. You have to, if you don't have your own quarantine room, which I'm lucky I kind of do. I'm in partnership with another grower here, so I don't have to pay for that. But the fees involved with inspections at the border and 2 further inspections in the quarantine room, the transport, the permits, all that kind of stuff is quite expensive and yeah, not for the faint-hearted. So
Yeah.
they all have to be dipped in insecticide, 2 different kinds of insecticide, 2 different kinds of miticide before they come into the country. So you have to have all that arranged and done. So they all have to be labeled correctly. It's a huge process.
I've heard
yeah.
costs between $200 and $400 per plant by the time you pay all these fees.
Yeah, it really depends on the cost of the plant, but you're talking a few
No,
thousand. You're talking a
I'm
few
saying
thousand New Zealand dollars to get all that done for each shipment, regardless of whether you bring in 10 plants or 1,000 plants.
Yeah,
it's
that's
like,
what I meant.
so yeah, it really depends on, you've got to do your economics with that. And so consequently, not a lot of people do it. It was very easy in the old days, but in 1998, the government changed all of the biosecurity rules here. So prior to that, we were getting plants through the post. I mean, going back into the 1950s,
Yeah.
Mulford Foster was posting plants to Muriel Waterman down here
Yeah.
through the post every month. And that's how most of our early species came into the country. And then after that, a lot of people did a lot of importing very regularly, but it all changed about just over 20 years ago now. And now there's only really myself and Peter Coyle, my friend, that are doing it, because we're the only ones that have a quarantine space to do it. You can't actually even hire a quarantine anymore. They've all closed down because it's so hard. So, I mean,
My friend, sorry.
yeah,
Go ahead.
you kind of can if you want to, but it's very difficult.
My friend Frenchie, my mentor, used to ship to Muriel. He was friends with Muriel. Back in the early 60s,
Yeah.
They used to ship to each other.
Yeah, she was one of the pioneers for. In fact, I think at one stage she had the best Bromeliad collection outside of Florida in the world, well, outside of obviously Brazil. But because of Mulford Foster, she was one of the first largest collectors outside of Florida. So it was great to have her start us off here, and that's why the New Zealand Society is so has such a long history. And then Australia obviously came around about the same time, and it's been great to keep it going down here. And you know, we have a lot of species and plants that grow well for us, and you know, things that do well for us don't do so well for you, and vice versa.
Yep.
So it's just the way it is.
It's true.
Have you been able to travel and see things in habitat?
Not, unfortunately, not at the moment. No, I've only been to your neck of the woods and to Florida. So I have seen bromeliads in habitat in Florida, but that's my extent to this to date. So that is my one of my goals. Obviously, is to at some stage get over to South America and Mexico eventually, and see some things. And yeah, it's going to be great.